This video is sponsored by Only Crits. Ever since the early days of Critical Role, it has been very clear that Matt Mercer wanted death to matter in his games a lot more than it usually does according to the rules of the D&D system. In one of their earliest Q&A sessions, they talked about how Pike died in their home game in a fight with a demon, and how they rushed her to a temple so they could get Raise Dead cast on her, and Matt had the player characters perform a ritual to see if they could successfully call Pike's spirit back to her body. Typically in D&D and Pathfinder, there's no risk of failure when you resurrect a party member. You get them to a temple, you pay the gold cost, your ally returns to life. But Matt wanted death in his games to feel more significant. However, because he was pushing back against the way the system is designed, we got to see his approach to resurrection evolve a little bit over the course of that first campaign. But ultimately, I don't think it ever manifested the way he was hoping for. I think that his efforts to make death matter in D&D kind of fell short of his goal. I don't think it was bad that he tried. I think the system he ultimately landed on wound up leading to some really incredible storytelling. I've used it in my own games to great effect, so I'm very happy with the final system he developed for his D&D games. But I'm not entirely sure he was ever happy. He kind of had to compromise what he wanted to do because ultimately the system he developed could never overcome the problems he was trying to fix because of the nature of the way resurrection works in D&D. But it's also really valuable to go back and take a look at how he wished death worked in D&D, because when he got a chance to help develop his own game system, Daggerheart, several years later, figuring out his pain points with D&D's resurrection system helps us understand how they landed on the fantastic system they have for handling character death in that game. And I'll be honest, originally this video was going to be about both of these topics. The introduction was going to be about how Matt handled death during his Critical Role campaigns, and the rest of the video was going to be about Daggerheart. Everything you're going to see in this video was supposed to be part of the introduction for another video you'll see probably next week. So obviously, it will not surprise you to learn that I eventually realized this is just two videos. So today we're going to cover the groundwork of seeing how Matt tried to adjust the rules for resurrection in his D&D games, and then next week I'll make that Daggerheart video about how the system handles death, and we'll have a baseline of seeing how Matt had already tried to tweak death for another heroic fantasy campaign, and it'll be interesting to watch that evolution play out as they get to their game that they can control from the beginning. Make sure you're subscribed because you don't want to miss that other video when it comes out later. Like I said, it should be coming out next week. However, this video does contain some spoilers for Campaign 1 of Critical Role, the Vox Machina campaign. There are no spoilers here for anything that comes after what I've already talked about on my channel in my Critical Role Demystified series. And everything that I'm discussing has already played out in some form across the first 3 seasons of the animated show, so if you're caught up with my content or you're caught up with the cartoon, there's not going to be any spoilers here you have to worry about. But if you haven't watched a lot of the first Critical Role campaign, if you don't know that much about the Vox Machina storyline, there are some spoilers around which characters die and the attempts to resurrect them. Now, originally I was going to dig into the way Raise Dead as a spell has evolved over time, since it was in the original game, but has changed a lot in some interesting ways that I think help reflect the shift in the overall culture of the hobby. And I actually do think that topic is fascinating, so I'll probably dig into that in a future video. Once again, a lot of different videos hiding in this video, but I want to dig up all the resurrection spells from all the editions of the game and see how they evolved. But again, we don't have time to get into that in this video either, so today all you need to know is that in the original game, when you were brought back to life, you had to sit out the game for a little while as your character healed. You had to recover back at the ranch, basically. Then in 3rd edition, they dropped that idea, and now if you were killed and brought back to life, you lost a level when you died, or 2 levels if you were playing Pathfinder 1st edition. And in 5th edition, they dropped that idea, and now when you get resurrected, you are just very tired, and you slowly regain your strength over the next few days. And the reason I bring that up, the reason I think that matters to today's topic, is because death in D&D has never really been a huge issue if you have access to the game's resurrection magic. If you can cast the spell, then death is just a minor inconvenience, and that's kind of always been the case, to varying degrees. And that inconvenience got even more minor with the introduction of Revivify in 3rd edition, and the way it got so much better as a spell in 5th edition, because now a properly prepared cleric can keep your party members around for a lot longer. And over the years, a lot of game masters wrestled with exactly the same problem Matt Mercer wrestled with for his own campaign. Players don't want their characters to die, so there should probably be some sort of resurrection magic available, otherwise they might get really upset when their characters die because they want to continue their story and they're not invested in the campaign overall. They were invested in their character's arc. But you also don't want death or resurrection to feel trivial. How do you make death matter when resurrection is so common and there are effectively no side effects? The solution for some game masters was just to make resurrection magic less available, or even remove it from the game entirely, or remove certain spells like Revivify. But Matt Mercer didn't want to do that. He still wanted there to be a possibility that these players could continue to play these characters after being killed. But a resurrection couldn't just be a trivial thing, like going unconscious in Pokemon, where you just wake up at the last town you went to, but otherwise you're basically fine. So he designed a ritual that his players would have to perform in order to bring back a fellow player character. When Vox Machina's cleric, Pike Trickfoot, died in their home game in a battle against a demon, the party rushed her to a temple after the fight where the priests of her goddess could perform the spell Raise Dead. And this is the first time they had to undergo one of Matt's resurrection rituals. 3 of the players have to make some sort of effort to connect with Pike or enhance the ritual or the magic or whatever in some way. These are functionally skill challenges, a system from 4th edition that Matt seemed to like a lot. The GM presents a challenge to the players decide how they want to try to solve it, and the GM tells them what skill to roll for if they want to do that. Depending on what they're trying to do, that might affect the DC for each individual task. Matt also requires that they all roll individual skills, rather than just everybody giving an emotional speech and everyone rolling for persuasion. At least that's the case with the resurrection rituals during the live stream. I assume it was also the case with Pike's ritual, even though it was Pathfinder. The rules may have been slightly different, but the basic thrust, I'm sure, was the same. Truthfully, we don't actually know a lot about the original ritual to bring Pike back to life, but we do know that Pike had a statue of Scanlan, and he had a statue of Pike. He had made those as he was courting her during the home games. And during the ritual, he sacrificed one of those statues, I believe the statue of Pike, to demonstrate his love for her. I don't know which other 2 players made an effort to contribute to the ritual, but we do know that their efforts lowered a resurrection DC, which is the difficulty for a roll that Matt would have to make. Because ultimately, even if they all succeed at what they're trying to do, Matt still wanted there to be some chance of failure, because ultimately death should feel like it's out of your hands, at least on some level. The DC to bring somebody back to life starts at 10. Every successful skill check made by a party member trying to contribute to the ritual reduces the death DC by 3, making it easier for that character to come back to life. Every failed attempt to contribute raises the DC by 1. So for example, let's say it was Grog, Scanlan, and Keyleth who helped bring Pike back to life. Let's say Grog and Scanlan succeeded on their attempts, but Keyleth rolled low, so she failed. The death DC starts at 10, but then it goes down by 3 because Grog succeeded, so our new DC is 7. Then Scanlan succeeds, so it goes down by 3 again to a new DC of 4. Then Keyleth tries to contribute, and she fails, so the DC goes back up by 1, to a total DC of 5. That brings us to the end of the ritual, where Matt rolls a die behind the screen, and it just has to beat the new DC, in this case, 5. This system means that if all 3 players succeeded in their skill checks, and they lower the DC by 9, it seems like there's still a chance that Matt could roll a natural 1, and that character would be dead forever. Although typically we need to meet or beat the DC to succeed, and if the DC is 1, you can't fail because you'll meet it by default, but I assume Matt would still consider rolling a 1 to be a failure. He and his players put a lot of emphasis on natural 20s and natural 1s. But still, a 1 in 20 chance gives you the best odds you're going to get in this system. That's if everybody succeeds on their contributions. If all 3 players fail, the DC doesn't go all the way up to 19, because that would be kind of insane. Instead, the DC only goes up by 1 for each failure. So if everybody fails, the highest DC you can get is 13, which means it'll still be hard to bring this person back to life, but those failed rolls don't completely ruin the chances that this player could come back to life. They don't have to blame the other players for not being able to keep playing this character. I think this is a better aspect of the design than we typically give it credit for. The system is designed in such a way that the players are encouraged to contribute to try to bring their friend back to life, because the consequences for failure are not nearly as steep as the reward for success. It incentivizes the players to get involved, and because this involves them essentially coming up with justifications to try to bring this character back to life and call upon their tethers to that character, it really rewards role-playing. Once again, returning to the death of Pike, we don't know what they all rolled in their home game, we don't know what Matt rolled behind the screen, but we know they managed to bring her back to life. We also know from the stories that they tell about it that the players were all just openly weeping during the ritual. So clearly the system works. Matt got exactly what he wanted. Death matters now. Even if you're potentially able to reverse it, the act of doing so is not a sure thing like it is in the base game. And in order to reverse a death, you essentially need to roleplay. You need to share sentiments at the table of how your character feels about this player character. You have to show that you're invested in the story. Now, like I said, some of those rules may have been slightly different in Pathfinder, but that's essentially the mechanics that we had in place when they started doing their live stream and playing the Vox Machina campaign for all of us to watch. And whenever somebody died, that system was exactly the same. At least up until episode 80 or so. Because as you've noticed if you follow my Critical Role Demystified series, this is where Matt started to tinker with the system, because he felt like the system was falling short of its goal. But before we get there, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Only Crits, and their Black Friday sale. So I'm actually going to hand things over to our Only Crits spokesman, Winnie the Pooh. Hello there! It's that time of year where you're going to start thinking about what gifts you should give to your friends and family. And what gift could be better than giving the brand new set of dice from today's sponsor, Only Crits, especially now with their Black Friday sale running for the rest of the week. Only Crits are such a fantastic selection of dice, you can really find something for everybody. They've got sharp-edged resin dice that look like gems and jewels, and they've got metal dice that have a lot of heft, but they also have these really cool and intricate designs on them. And dice with little cute animals inside them, like ducks and frogs and things. And if you can't decide what kind of dice that you want, want, you can sign up for a mystery dice set subscription, so every month you'll get a brand new set of dice in the mail as a fun surprise. And for the rest of the week, they have a really fantastic Black Friday sale. Maybe you want gemstone dice and metal dice and dice with the little cuties inside, but you can't decide which ones you want to get. Well, between now and Friday, if you buy 2 sets of dice, you can get a third for free. Additionally, if you sign up this week for the mystery subscription, you can get your first month for only $1. It's the perfect time to get all the dice you want from a really fantastic company. I love working with them. So go to onlycrits.com/supergeekmike and enjoy the Black Friday discounts. Get yourself some dice and get some dice for all your friends and family. Once again, that's onlycrits.com/supergeekmike and make sure to get your Black Friday discount before the end of the week. Thank you so much to Only Crits for sponsoring this video. Cheerio! Now, in order to understand why Matt felt he had to change his resurrection system after 80 episodes, let's quickly talk about some of the specific resurrection rituals we saw across the course of Campaign 1. See if you can notice a pattern that emerges, or rather, the pattern that does not emerge where you'd expect one. In the early episodes of the livestream, the party's on this mission in the Underdark, and eventually in episode 11, they face off against the Mad Beholder Kavarn. And during that fight, Grog the Barbarian is killed, and Pike casts Revivify on him, bringing him back to life with 1 hit point. But before Grog can come back to life, Matt has Ashley roll a single wisdom check. He's not having her do the full ritual because they're in the middle of combat, they don't have the opportunity to do all that, but he still wants there to be some chance of failure here. Otherwise, if they can just always cast Revivify without fail, that just contributes to the problem Matt is trying to solve. It makes death feel trivial. So she makes her roll, she successfully casts Revivify, and Grog lives again. However, cut to 33 episodes later. It's episode 44, the players are in a certain sunken tomb, and Vex has just been killed by a necrotic trap. Cashaw the Cleric, a guest character played by Will Friedle, casts Revivify on Vex, and the whole party has to participate in a full ritual to resurrect her. 3 players trying to entice the soul to return, and a final roll from Matt behind the screen. This is the ritual where her twin brother Vax strikes a deal with the Goddess of Death, which changes the entire trajectory of the campaign. This scene is honestly probably one of the most important scenes, maybe the most important scene in the entire campaign, and it would not have been possible without Matt's resurrection ritual. Likewise, the next time Grog dies because he betrayed his blood-drinking sword, Pike casts Revivify again, and once again they perform the whole ritual. 3 participants, either offering something to give him strength or enhance his resurrection magic, or just trying to petition his soul to return to his body. I love both of these scenes because they really encourage creative thinking on the part of the players. For example, during the Grog resurrection, Scanlan feeds Grog a potion of strength because this blood-drinking sword values strength, and so he thinks maybe they can satisfy its desire to devour his soul if they juice him up a little bit and basically trick the sword or give him strength that the sword just tried to take away from him. Matt has Scanlan roll an Arcana check because he's essentially trying to use this potion to coax Grog's body into being strong enough to resist this effect that killed him. Meanwhile, Vex poured some ale in Grog's mouth because they know he loves ale and they thought this would be something he would like. So Matt says that's a persuasion check, trying to entice his soul back to Earth, or Exandria. When Percy died later in the campaign in episode 68, which, by the way, the players were not able to cast Revivify because Pike was not with them, so they got him home to Whitestone and they could cast Raise Dead instead. I think they actually cast Resurrection because they wanted to go with the more expensive and potentially more powerful spell, even though the effects were basically the same. But they performed a full ritual to bring him back, and to the point I was starting to make here, most of the players who participated made tearful speeches to compel him to come back to life, sharing how much he meant to them. They were trying to stay true to what their characters would do, and Matt had to basically resolve what rolls they had to make based on what they said. It could be persuasion, or maybe religion if they're trying to use their connection with the gods, or performance if there was a musical aspect to it. And if it was just 2 emotional speeches, like it was from Vex and from Keyleth, Matt doesn't want you both rolling the same skill, so Keyleth had to just roll flat charisma, rather than also rolling persuasion because Vex already made a persuasion check, because Matt wants to encourage them to do different things. He wants to encourage them to be creative in these scenes. Yes, he also wants them to be truthful to their emotional reaction, and if that means 2 emotional speeches, then fair enough, but he still wants to encourage them to take different tactics rather than just relying on persuasion every time, because at that point, you would just have the bard do it every time. Again, Percy is the 3rd resurrection ritual of the campaign, actually 4th, if you count an NPC, a young boy who was killed as a hostage during the Kevdag fight. They cast a resurrection ritual on him after the fight and brought him back to life. But the results of all these rituals so far, to bring back party members or that NPC, have been incredibly dramatic, emotional, cathartic scenes. The system is working, and whether or not it's a Raise Dead spell or a Revivify spell, most of the time we've seen the full ritual, with one exception: Grog's Revivify in episode 11. However, when we got to episode 80, 2 of the players were killed in their first major battle with Raishan, the ancient green dragon. I guess technically it's their second battle with her, because they did fight her in episode 39, but this was the big climax of the Chroma Conclave storyline, or so they thought at the time. And during that battle, Pike had to cast Revivify on 2 more party members. Vex, and Scanlan. And once again, they were in the middle of a battle, so they couldn't do a full ritual. So once again, Matt just had Pike make a wisdom check. Laura and Liam were playing Pike at the time, and they added a little bit of flavor to each of these roles, basically treating them like a contribution to one of these larger rituals. When Pike resurrected Vex, she cut off a lock of her own hair, but more significantly, when Pike resurrected Scanlan, she referenced a letter Scanlan had given her, sharing why she wanted him to come back to life, drawing upon the connection they had and their shared history. But she didn't actually need to do the full ritual. Matt was ruling this as a simple ability check. However, that seemed to me to be a choice he was making in the moment, not some codified rule that he had. Because I don't think he actually had a rule for what happens when you cast this spell, Revivify. He had his resurrection ritual system, and so whenever they cast Revivify and they weren't in combat, he would just use that same system again. But when they were in battle, he still wanted there to be some chance of failure, but he couldn't justify putting them through the whole ritual right now, not when there's also a dragon or a beholder buzzing above their heads. So he would always compromise in the moment with what always wound up to be a single wisdom check. It was a reasonable solution, but it doesn't seem like it was a clear rule that he'd already come up with. It felt like a judgment call. Sometimes you could even see him weighing the fact that this should be a ritual based on his own rules, but it made no sense to treat it as one, so he just had to default to boiling it down to a single roll, which he did every time, but every time it seemed like he was struggling to figure out how to handle the situation.
Now, this is mid-combat. For the purposes of this...
Oh, God.
How long does it take to cast?
It's instantaneous.
No,
It's been less than 6 seconds.
One action, instantaneous.
Yeah, she did.
Touch.
Yeah, less than 6 seconds, man. Same
Well,
round.
I understand.
So,
No,
this is going to be a rapid resurrection skill check.
Oh, God, really? Okay.
man.
Yeah. But this is only from Pike because it is a singular roll.
Can Ashley roll? Do you want to roll, Ashley?
As Pike rushes up, what does Pike utilize to implore Vex's soul to return?
As you can tell, it really doesn't seem like he had a clear system in mind for how to handle Revivify. So after this episode, he realized he needed to revise these rules and carve out some specific idea for what would happen when they cast Revivify going forward. And I think what he decided on was a very reasonable solution. He stuck with the single ability check when you cast Revivify, and you're still rolling against that character's death DC, just like Matt would do behind the screen, but it hasn't been raised or lowered in any way. So these new rules clarify that if you fail this check, that character is not dead forever. Instead, you just can't use Revivify again on that same character, at least before they are brought back to life. You can only bring them back now with a spell that has a casting time longer than a single action, so something like Raise Dead or Resurrection. Again, that's only a problem for this specific death. Once they come back to life and they die again, you could use Revivify again, but you'd have to make that roll again, and the DC would be higher, because that's another change Matt felt he needed to make after the big fight in episode 80. Because it started to seem like there was a problem with his system. His players kept surviving death. At this point, Pike had died once, Vex had died twice, Scanlan had died once, Percy had died once, Grog had died twice. That's most of the party. It was starting to feel, once again, like death didn't matter. Now, I don't think his players felt this way, but Matt did. I think he felt it was getting too easy to bring people back to life. After all, what's the point in adding a potential risk of failure to a task if nobody actually fails? I mean, I would personally argue that that's perfectly fine as long as the end result is still dramatic, which it inarguably is, so I don't actually think we're losing anything when the players happen to survive another resurrection ritual, but I can also understand the sentiment that bringing people back to life over and over should have some sort of consequence. The same thing happened with one of my own characters. He once died twice, you know what I mean. And the GM said, okay, normally you could just bring him back to life, that's what the spell says, but this is his second death in like a week. I think his soul's connection to his body is getting harder to maintain. So you need to roll something if you're going to try to resurrect him. And my GM didn't watch Critical Role. He wasn't borrowing an idea from Matt Mercer. This was just parallel thinking stemming from the same root problem. The more you bring someone back to life, the cheaper death starts to feel. And it just so happens that you could go listen to that campaign if you were so inclined. The algorithm wizard said I couldn't say any more than that, but you know what, do with that information what you will. So I can understand why Matt basically felt like repeat deaths need to be more difficult to reverse. So somewhere between the end of episode 80 and the beginning of episode 82, I don't remember exactly when, but Matt posted on social media that he was going to change the death system a little bit. He codified the new rules about Revivify that we just talked about, where it would not be a permanent death if you failed, but you definitely had to still make a roll, but it was only one roll. All that stuff we just discussed was now in the rules. But he also added that every time you die, the death DC goes up by 5. So for example, if Vax dies in the next episode, that would be his first death, so the DC to bring him back to life still starts at 10, and it still goes up and down based on the contributions made during the resurrection ritual. If they succeed in bringing him back to life, but he dies a second time, then the DC is now 15, which means 3 successful contributions to the ritual would only bring it down to a 6, so 75% chance of success. If he dies a third time, the DC starts at 20, which means the best the players can get, the DC to, is 11. That's a 50% chance he'll die forever. And if their contributions to the ritual fail, if they all roll low, the DC could go up to 23, something Matt literally couldn't hit unless he allowed himself to get a success on a natural 20, which, again, he probably would. But yeah, these new rules are a pretty radical change. This system is basically guaranteed to start killing characters the more frequently they die. I don't even necessarily think that's a bad system in theory. Like, I do think it's reasonable if you're running a high lethality game where life is cheap, that it would be a lot harder to bring them back to life every time. I could absolutely see the logic in that. I could see this being presented in the rules as a optional rule, like a equivalent of the grim darkness rules that are in the Dungeon Master's Guide, that kind of thing. However, I think this new system was a huge departure from the tone of the campaign Matt was running. This was a high fantasy, epic fantasy campaign. The players were teleporting across the world and hunting dragons and becoming champions of gods. This wasn't a meat grinder campaign. But this approach to resurrection is much more of a meat grinder mode. Or, as much as it could be in a game that still has robust resurrection rules. And to be honest, it freaked the players out. In episode 82, Vax asked Pike to cast Death Ward on his sister Vex, and he clarified for the table that he was doing this specifically because Matt had just changed the resurrection rules, and Liam was worried that since Vex had already died twice, her next death DC would now be 20, which meant trying to bring her back to life would be much, much more difficult. Now, I'm all for players taking precautions before battle. Let's be honest, the best way to avoid your character dying permanently is to avoid your character dying at all. But this change to the rules really put the fear of God into these players, and I was starting to think that that was maybe damaging their sense of fun. Additionally, there were a lot of people watching the game who wanted to use Matt's resurrection rules because they loved these rituals and the way that they brought out fantastic role-playing from the characters. Some of the best scenes in the game are these resurrection rituals. But unlike the cast of Vox Machina, these people were running home games for much lower level parties. The fact that most of the deaths on Critical Role happened when the players were past level 12 really changes how reasonable it is to raise the DC so high after every time they die. I mean, let's be fair, the members of Vox Machina are level 15 or 16 at this point in the campaign. How much longer does Matt expect the campaign to go? How many more deaths are in their future? But people in their home games might be starting to deal with character death and resurrection as early as level 5, which means a system that raises the DC by 5 every time is going to cause more player character churn. And once again, if that's the system you want to run, that's completely fair. But when you're trying to graft any new system onto an existing game, like D&D, you have to figure out how it's going to interface with your players' expectations. And if you're sharing those rules with a wider audience, you also have to factor in the existing community for that game and their expectations for what kind of stories they want to tell. This is especially true for the cast of Critical Role because their audience wants to replicate the emotional, character-first storytelling they see on the show. So if your system is designed to just churn through player characters whenever they die, I think it's worth asking whether or not that successfully helps players recreate the vibe of your show or not. Yes, the stakes are high in any episode of Critical Role, death is always on the table, but part of the reason they can still have these commitments to these intense character bonds is because they also know the resurrection is also always on the table. But it's also not a guarantee, which helps them from treating it too flippantly. They still have a very healthy respect for death. They still live and die by every death save rolled. But when Matt tried to make it harder to bring these characters back to life, I just don't think he realized how much that approach would have clashed with the tone of the game he was running. So by the time we got to episode 82, when Liam made the request for his sister to be spared with the Death Ward spell, and he admitted he was doing so because Matt's new death rule scared him, Matt clarified that based on the reaction of the players and the reaction of the audience, he was now considering dropping the raising of the DC down to only 2 every time you die. So when you die, it wouldn't go up by 5 for every repeated death, it would go up by 2. And by the time we got to episode 83 and some other characters did actually start dying in battle, Matt had already shared the final version of the rules. He'd scaled it back even more. Every time you die and get brought back to life, the DC will be 1 higher the next time you die. Percy died once in episode 68, so when he died again in episode 83, the DC to bring him back to life was 11 instead of 10 because of that one previous death. However, Revivify also had a cost now. This was the compromise that Matt made. If you tried to cast Revivify on somebody and failed, you needed to use a full ritual to bring them back to life, but the DC to bring them back also went up by 1 again. So Scanlan died in episode 80, the DC to bring him back to life at the time was 10, then he died again in episode 80, so the DC to resurrect him from that second death is 11. Pike tries to revive him and fails, and so now they need to bring him back using a full ritual, which they're going to do in episode 84, which we're going to talk about soon. But the DC for that ritual is now 12 instead of 11, because they tried and failed to use Revivify. That was the compromise. And this is ultimately the best the system ever got when Matt was running D&D across the 3 Critical Role campaigns. It started with the clear premise of trying to make death more meaningful by making resurrection more challenging. Then, as the campaign went on and he worried death was once again feeling too trivial, he tried to ramp up death a little bit more. But this time he got a lot of pushback from his cast and from the audience because what he wanted was not consistent with the tone of the base game they were using, and even the tone of the campaign he was running. So he compromised by making it a little bit less severe. And of course, in the background of all this, we still have all the other objections people already have with death in D&D, like the fact that a player winds up doing nothing for the entire battle if they're unconscious or dead, or the fact that the lead up to your death could be marked by just several turns of rolling death saves, which might not be terribly satisfying, or the concept that diamonds used for resurrection spells would now have a very different cost in a D&D economy. Or just the fact that your death could come when your storyline is not complete because the randomness of dice rolls do not always conform to our narrative expectations of a satisfying story. Matt wasn't even trying to fix or address any of these problems. He was just trying to resolve the one thing that bothered him, the fact that resurrection magic trivialized death. But ultimately, unless you can actually tackle the entire concept of death from square one, then every change you make to an existing system is going to be a compromise of some sort. And when Matt grafted his resurrection system onto D&D's base design, there was another unexpected side effect. It hindered his players' ability to roleplay any significant moments of loss. When Percy was killed in episode 68, the party wasn't sure if they should grieve him or not, because the option to bring him back to life was still on the table. He was dead, but they knew a cleric who could bring him back to life. But they also knew there was a chance that the ritual could fail, so they couldn't just say, he'll be fine, which is good. That's what Matt was trying to avoid. They were stressed about the resurrection for a week until they finally got him to a cleric in the next session. And even if the ritual was a guaranteed success, as it so often is in D&D, Percy just faced the last of his demons. He'd functionally dealt with a lot of his issues. Would he even want to come back? Even Percy's player wasn't sure whether or not he wanted Percy to come back, or whether he wanted to sunset the character and roll up a new one. Even Percy's player, Taliesin Jaffe, wasn't sure whether he wanted Percy to come back or not, because it was a very fitting end. And even if he was sure, there was no guarantee it was going to be possible. Because of the death rules in D&D, and Matt's homebrew approach to handling them in his own games, a major player character was basically Schrodinger's cat for a week. Because after the characters hit level 5 or 7 or so, the death and resurrection mechanics in D&D kind of deny the players the one thing death typically gives people in almost every other form of fiction: closure. But even Matt's approach still left the players in this weird limbo for an entire week where they couldn't mourn their ally, even though he was currently dead, but they also couldn't just say, don't worry, we can get him back, which is typically how it works in D&D. But not in these games. The players had made a pact back in their home games that if a character died, like really died, they would all go out for drinks afterwards and drink to their memory. But in the aftermath of Percy's death, Marisha really wanted to know, is he dead? Should we grieve for him? Should we go get drinks like we promised? But no one could answer that question, because thanks to a combination of D&D's resurrection mechanics and Matt's resurrection rules, they couldn't know the answer one way or the other. And this really demonstrates the limits of trying to build a death system like that sits on top of an existing system, because you're not in control of the other systems of the game, and you're coming into a game system that has its own existing fan base and their own expectations for how the game works. So any reforms you make to any mechanic are going to have these ripple effects that you may not expect. I don't think Matt realized just how much this was going to change the way his players could or couldn't grieve somebody if they ended a session before getting a chance to try to resurrect them. But it really did. This is why so many players who don't like this level of resurrection in D&D will just remove it entirely when they get a chance to make their own game. When you're playing Shadow Dark, you never have to wonder whether or not a character's death means you're going to see that character come back again. It doesn't. The entire game is structured around the core premise that life is cheap, and the community that has been built up around the game has picked it up with that very clear understanding in mind. Any resurrection spells you might introduce into that game, whether because you homebrewed something or found something on Reddit or in some other supplement to the game, all of that is an exception to the core assumption of the game, which is that when your character dies, they're dead. Raise a glass to them, and then roll up a new character. It'll take about 2 minutes. So when Matt got the opportunity to design his own system, Daggerheart, he had the opportunity to decide how death works from the ground up, rather than grafting a homebrew system onto an existing mechanic. And I think it is fascinating to look at the Daggerheart death system and see how it basically accomplishes everything Matt wanted for his own games, because it actually makes death matter. And so that's what we're going to talk about in another video soon. We're going to talk about Daggerheart's approach to death, and how even though it doesn't bear a lot of resemblance to Matt's resurrection system in D&D, there's no rituals, no skill challenges, no death DC. But I think we can still see Daggerheart working off of the same very clear design goal: make death feel consequential. Solve a lot of the other problems Matt was tackling, and solve a lot of problems that came up during the campaign that Matt did not anticipate. We'll talk about how they pulled it off in another video very soon. So if you want to make sure to catch that Daggerheart video when that comes out, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Sometimes people think they're subscribed, but YouTube unsubscribes them if they miss a couple of videos, and I had a lot of videos recently, so that might have happened to you. So just scroll down, make sure you're good. Make sure you also hit the bell so you get notified whenever I drop new videos. I've pretty much abandoned my release schedule. The videos come out whenever they get finished. Sometimes that means they come out at really strange times, and sometimes a bunch of them come out in a bunch of days in a row, like, I don't know, maybe hypothetically 6 videos in the past week, and you might have missed some of them, so make sure you ring that bell so that doesn't happen. You do not want to miss anything. You should hang around this channel and not miss anything. And until next time, play fair and have fun. Okay, I think Odwick is not watching. I think we're good. This video is sponsored by Only Crits, so I'm going to hand things over to our Only Crits spokesman, Winnie the Pooh. Hello there, it's me, Winnie the Pooh. I'm here to talk about Only Crits Black Friday sale. Wait, didn't we just do this? Mike, why'd you call me back in? You and I need to talk.